This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Susan.
And I'm Heather.
And we're in the book of 2 Samuel.
Welcome to the club. Last episode, David was trying to hide his sin. He had committed two major sins from the 10 Commandments, adultery and murder. But God knows everything, and he wants it brought to light. So God sends Nathan, a prophet, to rebuke David. Nathan tells David a clever story of injustice about some other man and his lamb. David is furious about this injustice. Nathan then accuses David of the same injustice. David gets it. He's immediately convicted and he repents. God forgives David and his relationship with God is restored. However, there are still consequences to our sin. The sword will never depart from David's dynasty, and David's family will experience tragedy. David accepts these consequences, the first of which was the loss of his infant son born to Bathsheba. David's restoration with God gives birth to hope, and hope to life. David and Bathsheba then have a second son named Solomon, whom the Lord loves.
All right, there are a lot of scenes in this chapter, and each scene has a different combination of 5 different characters. They include David and 3 of his children, Amnon, Absalom, and Tamar. And then there's this other guy, Jonadab, a no-good advisor. All right, first, Amnon is David's firstborn. He's the son of David's second wife, Ahinoam. Now, David never had a child with his first wife, Saul's daughter, Michal. So we're on the second wife. Absalom is David's third son. He was born to Maakah, his fourth wife. Tamar, David's daughter, was also born to Maakah. So Absalom and Tamar are super close because they have the same mother and father. Now, there was a second son between Amnon and Absalom, and it's important to talk about because we're going to talk about like the line to the throne. His name is Kileab, or sometimes he's called Daniel. He was the son of Abigail, my favorite wife, and he must be wise like his mother because he manages to stay out of this sordid story. Or it is possible that he had died by this time because he's never mentioned as a contender for the crown. Okay, David's family dynamic seems complicated and for good reason. 1 Chronicles 3 states that David had 19 sons by his wives, and it also states that there were many more sons from concubines. How many, we do not know. But the Bible implies here in this chapter that there were different households that had been established, and the half-siblings were probably more like cousins with the added complication of having to vie for their same father's attention. Does that make sense? They didn't live in the same household, but they really were half siblings. So they're kind of more like cousins. Now, how much time David spent with each wife and child was probably a point of hot contention. And that is why this family dynamic is so complicated. Like his forefathers before him, Abraham and Jacob, David had too many wives. The wives had too many sons, which meant too many heirs to the throne, which led to too much rivalry. And when you add to the rivalry a curse that the sword will never depart from your house, you end up with blood on your hands. And that's where we're going. That's precisely where David is headed in this chapter. Now, when the scene first opens, it begins with in the course of time. Remember back in episode 6, we discovered that the author subtly revealed important shifts in the story of David by using this phrase, in the course of time. The phrase is a transition indicator. It shifted at the beginning of chapter 9 and again at the beginning of chapter 10, both stories of David's hesed or kindness, good stories. The phrase in the course of time will be repeated again here in chapter 13, verse 1. But the story in this unit is not about David's hesed or kindness. It's the opposite, a bad story. It's the story of how the consequences of David's sin, a passion for women, wives, and Bathsheba, destroy the peace in his dynasty. David took what he wanted, and David will pay for it with consequences inflicted on himself and his family. These, in the course of time, transitions highlight David's fall by bookending his fall with a before and an after. Before Bathsheba, David experienced victory and blessing from God. And in the overflow of his blessing, David offered hesed and kindness to others. After Bathsheba, David will experience waves of consequences to his family unleashed by his sin. And in the overflow of the consequences, David now needs hesed from God. Does that make sense? It's kind of a before and after picture of him. It's kind of sad. All right, let's dive into scene 1. Like father, like son, Amnon is distracted by women. The story begins with a conversation between Jonadab and Amnon.
2 Samuel chapter 13. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her.
The first thing we can't miss is the creativity of our author. The way he introduces the characters is a silent message. The names of the brothers frame the sister. She is caught between Amnon and Absalom. One brother is obsessed with pleasure, the other with power. She's the victim in the middle. Note also that while Amnon is introduced first, Tamar is noted as the sister of Absalom. And Absalom is actually the larger focus of the story we're going to discover. The scene starts with a very entitled Amnon, frustrated with his sexual unfulfillment. He describes his feelings as love, but clearly they are not. The situation is dire in his mind, for he is doomed to be frustrated forever, according to the law of Israel, and he knows this. Leviticus 18:9 clearly prohibited incest, even with the half-sister.
Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she is born in the same home or elsewhere.
In this case, she may have been born in a different household, but he still can't have sex with her. On top of that, this sister is a virgin, and there were laws about that too in Deuteronomy 22:28.
If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives.
And lastly, if a brother marries a sister or half-sister, they are to be removed from the community according to Leviticus 20:17.
If a man marries his sister, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and they have sexual relations, it is a disgrace. They are to be publicly removed from their people. He has dishonored his sister and will be held responsible.
Amnon simply cannot have what he wants, Tamar. If he marries her and has sexual relations, they will be ostracized. If he rapes her, he will have to marry her and they will be ostracized. The law is stacked against him and he is suffering from his sinful obsession.
Continuing in verse 3. Now Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, son of Shimei, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand.'"
Jonadab is the son of David's brother and therefore Amnon's cousin. A lot of family in this story. The passage points out that he is shrewd and an advisor of some sort. Reality reveals he is deviously depraved. Jonadab's idea is simple. Use your father to get her to come to you. You're the king's son. Then in the privacy of your room, maybe she'll be willing. Maybe she won't, and you'll have to force her. Either way, she's in your room. Amnon's only option to satisfy his lust is deception in the hope that it will lead to a clandestine affair. This is exactly what David hoped for when he sent for Bathsheba. Like father, like son, lust drives them to sin.
I know all sins are equal in the eyes of God, But this just seems a little more than what David did with Bathsheba, because his cousin is trying to help him rape his own sister, which just is really egregious.
Yeah, and all the commentaries agree. It's very clear here that Tamar is forced. Bathsheba was not forced. So David hoped for a clandestine affair, and he got it. She was willing in this case. I think Amnon had a heads up that Tamar would not agree, and so he is being more
really
premeditated.
Yeah.
Scene 2, Amnon and David and Tamar.
Verse 6. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight so I may eat from her hand. David sent word to Tamar at the palace, go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him.
Note for later, Tamar apparently lived in the palace while Amnon had his own house. We'll get to that later. In this scene, David was manipulated into complicity. He was the link between Amnon and Tamar. David commanded Tamar to go to her brother. How was David so blind and disengaged from his children? Perhaps because there were so many. They didn't even live with him, so he probably didn't know them all well. How was he so distracted that he did not stop to think, why Tamar? She was beautiful, just like Bathsheba. Certainly he's been down this road before with himself. How was David so disrespected by his son that Amnon thought nothing of manipulating his father? Amnon used his position and influence as the firstborn future king to take what he wanted from David, the current king. Just as David used his position and influence to take what he wanted from Uriah. Like father, like son, they used their power to sin.
I think there's even another element where his cousin is influencing him negatively as well. So you really want to surround yourself with people who, totally. If you have this idea that is wrong, who's going to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we don't want to do that, instead of being like, hey, let me help you hatch a plan.
Yeah. All right, scene 3, Tamar and Amnon.
Verse 8. So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. Send everyone out of here, Amnon said. So everyone left him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come to bed with me, my sister. No, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you.
Amnon began with force. He grabbed her, it says first, so she could not escape. And then he asked for her compliance, come to bed with me. The fact that he calls her my sister emphasizes the depravity of his sin. He's almost calling her my sister as like an endearment, when in fact it's sick. His actions reveal his heart. Amnon does not love her. This is all about him, and he was going to do what he wanted. Tamar, then, with pronounced integrity, responds with reason. Her arguments are so sound, and she begs him to spare her from ruin. First, by calling him my brother, in response to his calling her my sister, she's underscoring the truth of their relationship. Second, she begs him not to force or rape her. She implies that he must think of himself and his position in Israel. He was a leader as prince and should abide by the laws of Israel, and this was breaking every law. Third, he should think of her, his sister. She would be in disgrace for the rest of her life, no doubt about it. It was a cultural thing. Fourth, if he must have her against her will, and one must assume that he was physically overpowering her by this time, he must marry her to protect her honor. Now, marrying her would be illegal, as discussed in Leviticus 20 that Heather just read, but Tamar is desperate and reasons that their father, the king, could make it happen.
Verse 14, but he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." "No," she said to him, "sending me away would be greater wrong than what you've already done to me." But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of my sight and bolt the door after her."
Amnon is lost to Tamar's attempt to reason with him. He refused to listen, and because he was stronger, he got what he wanted. Amnon did not care about the hurt he was inflicting on others. His only thought was to satisfy his own pleasure. David acted similarly with Bathsheba and then Uriah, of course, without any care for the hurt he was inflicting on others. His only thought was to satisfy his own pleasure. Like father, like son, they both took advantage of others. Now, once Amnon's lust is satiated, and this is the saddest part of the whole story to me, his feelings are turned upside down. His passionate desire becomes an equally passionate hatred. He commands Tamar to get out. She begs again for his protection, and he refuses to listen. Then, calling her this woman, he has her thrown out by a servant. Tamar has gone from, "My sister, come to bed with me," whom he loves, to this woman he can't stand to even look at, and he throws out the door. Scene 4. Tamar and Absalom.
Verse 18, so Amnon's servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away weeping aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon your brother been with you?" "Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman.
So when David was ordained, way back in the beginning when he was chosen as king, he was chosen because he was a man after God's own heart. It's so interesting to me that so much of what we know of David is his heart. And yet here, because of his sin, we're seeing that Absalom is heartless and Tamar is brokenhearted. These are his children, and that's kind of the consequence of what happened. So Tamar has been betrayed by her own brother and cast out on the street to face her public humiliation all alone. The ornate robe she wore identified her as the daughter of the king, as a princess, and this type of robe is only mentioned in one other place in the Bible. In Genesis, Joseph had a similar robe. It was ornate, designating the wearer as special. The author states that this robe designated Tamar as a virgin daughter of the king. So, of course, Tamar publicly proclaims her despair with tears, and she tears the robe because her virginity has been torn from her. Tamar is not the first nor the last to be so violently abused in the Bible. Isaiah must have been thinking of women like Tamar when he prophesied about Jesus in Isaiah 61:1.
He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning.
Tamar was brokenhearted. Jesus came to bind up the brokenhearted. Tamar became a captive to her shame, living her life out in her brother's home. Jesus came to free the captives. Tamar covered herself in ashes. Jesus came to replace the ashes with a crown of beauty. At some point, Absalom finds Tamar and figures out what had happened to her. His advice is to be quiet because Amnon is her brother, aka the crown prince. It sounds like he is treating the incident as trivial, but we'll see he is just patiently biding his time. He tells her not to take this thing to heart because he is taking it to heart for her and will seek revenge on her behalf. Now note, Tamar goes to live with Absalom, a desolate woman. She no longer lives at the palace. Was she mad at David? Was she not allowed to live at the palace because she'd been violated? Or did she feel unsafe at the palace and chose to live under Absalom's protection? Did David ever see her again? Or was she out of sight and out of mind to David? We don't know, and I'm so curious about that. All right, scene 5. David reacts, but fails to act.
Verse 21, when King David heard all this, he was furious, and Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar.
David is furious. He has emotion about this, but he takes no action. Amnon receives not a single consequence from his father. David does nothing. Is that perhaps why Tamar no longer lives at the palace? Because she was so hurt by David's lack of justice that she couldn't bear to look him in the eye? Or was she banished from the palace because David's guilt was so painful that he couldn't bear to look her in the eye? Where was David's heart and head to fail so miserably as the leader of his family in Israel? Perhaps his own similar sin with Bathsheba paralyzed him with guilt. Perhaps his pride silenced him. After all, he was the one manipulated by Amnon into sending Tamar to him. David told her to go to Amnon. It almost looks like he was complicit. Or maybe he was afraid that if this came out about his children, so would the whole affair with Bathsheba. And David had gone to great lengths, murder even, to hide his own affair. Perhaps David still cared too much about what people thought and put ahead of what was right in the eyes of the Lord, which would have been justice for Tamar and ostracizing Amnon.
I think it's also worth mentioning that this is not the first instance of rape that we have seen in the Bible. And in the other instances, there's 2, right? 2 other ones that we've already read about.
Multiple. Actually, there's more than 2.
More than 2. Okay. So we've already read several instances. And I think in almost every one, there was an avenger. Mm-hmm. And in this case, David, contrasted by those other cases, it's quite the opposite. So that's another snowball effect of the sin that you have in your life. And then you have to continue covering it up.
Right. Or perhaps David has another weakness. We were seeing he's sinfully passive father, and he could not bear to do the right thing. Cut off his firstborn son and cast him out of Israel as the law commanded in Leviticus 20:17, because that was really his only choice. There's so much we don't know about this story. Surely it rocked the entire extended family. Where was Tamar's mother? Did she not attempt to seek justice for Tamar? Where were all the rest of David's wives? They must have gathered in protest out of concern for their daughters too, because Amnon could do this again. Amnon was the next in line to be king, and he had behaved like a monster. How many more sisters would Amnon attack if he went unchecked? Lastly, where was Nathan to convict David, that prophet that was so good about confronting him? We don't know. But David was very in need of his go-to prophet. Scene 6, Absalom and David and Amnon.
Verse 23, 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor, near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" "No, my son," the king replied, "all of us should not go. We would only be a burden on you." Although Absalom urged him, he still refused to go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent with him Amnon and the rest of the king's sons.
So 2 whole years go by while David's silence grows ominous, Tamar's identity withers, and Absalom's revenge builds. Finally, Absalom invites David to attend the sheep shearing celebration. Now, remember, we covered this when we studied Abigail. It was a big deal. It was a festival. And remember, once upon a time, David had been a shepherd. So the whole thing makes sense. This is like a local festival, a county fair, and you would want to have, important people come, like the mayor or your father, the king. Now, Absalom expected to be rejected by David. It would be a great expense and trouble for the king to attend to travel with all his attendants and hoopla. Absalom most likely extended the invitation to avoid suspicion. He didn't really expect David to come. The king regrets, as expected, so Absalom asks for the next best influencer in the family to create a stir at his event. Again, this makes sense. If the governor can't come, you invite the mayor. So the king can't come, he invites the crown prince, Amnon, to attend. David questions the request, but Absalom urges and David acquiesces again, just like he did when Amnon wanted Tamar to bake him bread. Like, what a weird request. Why does your sister need to come bake you bread? Perhaps, David hoped it would be good for Amnon to honor his brother and help them to heal from the Tamar incident. We don't know. Maybe he was like, oh, I'm so glad he's inviting his brother. That's a cool thing. The brothers need to get together. I don't know. We don't know. But you would think David would learn to pay a little more attention to these requests. For a man after God's own heart, David seems oddly oblivious to the hearts of his children. Scene 7. Absalom's revenge on Amnon. Absalom's revenge was a slow, patient build to more than justice. He was building a following. The obvious motive was revenge for the rape of Tamar, but the murder had a silver lining. You see, Amnon was the heir and Absalom was a spare. The death of Amnon moved Absalom into the first position to inherit the crown. So he wasn't just doing it for revenge. Abigail's son, Kileab, sometimes called Daniel, was the second son. But remember, it's assumed he may have died because he's not in the picture. He's not a son to be killed so that Absalom can get to the crown. Absalom's plan was deceptive and clever like Amnon's was. He used David to get what he wants, just like his brother. In both the rape and the murder, David is the link that makes it happen. David was the link between Amnon and Tamar in her rape. David sent Tamar to Amnon to bake bread. He delivered Tamar right into the hands of her rapist. And now David is the link between Absalom and Amnon in his murder. David sent Amnon to Absalom to attend the sheep shearing. He delivered Amnon right into the hands of his murderer.
Verse 28. Absalom ordered his men, listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave. So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. While they were on their way, the report came to David. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground, and all his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. But Jonadab, son of Shimei, David's brother, said, my lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's express intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. My lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead. Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. Now, the man standing watch looked up and saw many people on the road west of him, coming down the side of the hill. The watchman went and told the king, I see men in the direction of Ahinoam on the side of the hill. Jonadab said to the king, see, the king's sons have come. It has happened just as your servant said. As he finished speaking, the king's sons came in wailing loudly. The king too and all his attendants wept very bitterly. Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned many days for his son. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years, and King David longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death.
So Absalom's men attack and kill Amnon. David hears that all the sons have been killed. Now, Jonadab, the shrewd, not to be trusted advisor, was on hand to inform David what really happened, which is super strange, as Jonadab was Amnon's advisor in the rape. So how did he become Absalom's advisor and learn about the plan to kill Amnon? The guy plays both sides. And if he knew that Absalom was planning to kill Amnon, why didn't he try to stop it? David has lost another son and mourns for him. Absalom flees to Geshur, and David longs to go for him. And there we have it. David's sin has come full circle in his sons. Amnon sinned sexually with Tamar, like his father sinned sexually with Bathsheba. Absalom murdered Amnon, just like his father murdered Uriah. Like father, like son. Sin spirals out from one generation to the next. Well, there was another son way back in Genesis who killed his brother. Adam had a son just like David did. Adam sinned just like David sinned. Adam's son, Cain, murdered his brother, and David's son, Absalom, murdered his brother. There is nothing new under the sun. The story of sin is an old one. If only we would heed what God said to Cain way back in Genesis 3 when he made his mistake.
Genesis 3, verse 7, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.
Cain didn't heed God's warning. David didn't either, nor did Amnon or Absalom. Sin desires to have us. We must rule over it. It is a goal for us to constantly keep in mind, for our own good and for the good of our families, because we can overcome temptation. All things are possible with the Lord.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.